Okay, good evening. I think we should start. So if you can hear me, can you give me some response? Okay, thank you very much. This is the second lecture on public housing. So today we will discuss issues of managing resources in public housing with specific illustration on the allocation of public housing and also on the finance and rent setting. Although I'll spend more time on rent setting, but we'll touch on a little bit on housing finance or public housing. Well, we have a concern for public housing distribution of resources because we observe some very big discrepancy between, for instance, the rents paid by tenants in subdivided unit, which on the average, they may have to pay 3,000 and 4,000 for this type of subdivided unit. Whereas the median rent of the subdivided unit reflected in a survey done in 2020 was around or close to 5,000. Whereas if you are lucky to get a public housing unit in Hong Kong, something like this, of course, the internal renovation will not be that elaborate. So that has to be borne by the tenants themselves. But the rent itself is quite decent. So such a unit, if it is not in the urban area, whereas in the new territory, it will cost you about 2,000 and 3,000. So that is very, very substantially lower than the rent in private sector. And if you look at the official so-called publicity of the housing authority, in fact, you may appreciate both the quality and quality of life and also the facility in public housing. Although those images apply more to new public housing rather than some public housing that are quite old. But at least the quality of public housing is quite decent. Let me see whether I can show this sound.
This is our home.
Can you hear the sound of the video? Okay.
There are over 7 million people in Hong Kong, and more than 2 million live in public housing estates under the auspices of the Hong Kong Housing Authority. They provide a comfortable environment and a full range of basic facilities for tenants. The accomplishments of today's public housing have actually evolved over the past 6 decades. On Christmas night 1953, a fire broke out in the Shek Kip Mei squatter area. Over 53,000 people were made homeless. This crisis persuaded the government to build resettlement blocks to house both the fire victims and other squatter dwellers. In 1954, the first batch of resettlement blocks was built in Shek Kip Mei. The government set up the then Hong Kong Housing Authority, a semi-independent organization providing low to middle-income families low-cost housing with basic provisions. In 1972, the government announced a 10-year housing program and established the Hong Kong Housing Authority in 1973, putting management of all resettlement blocks and low-cost housing estates under one roof. The Housing Authority is a policy-making body which formulates policies on planning, design, construction, maintenance and management of public housing. while the Housing Department carries out the policies and day-to-day operations. Over the years, design of public housing has seen continuous improvements. Resettlement blocks of the 1950s were of 6 or 7 stories high. Residents had to share toilets, bathrooms and tap water in the middle section of each floor. Slab blocks of the 1960s were 16 stories high, with lift access for every 3 floors. Twin tower blocks of the 1970s were over 20 floors high, with lift access to all levels. Trident blocks of the 1980s were generally 35 stories in height, with 3 separate wings connected by a lift lobby in the center. Harmony blocks of the 1990s were mainly in cruciform shape and of 40 floors high. Major improvements have also been made in flat layouts. Flats in earlier resettlement blocks were small in size and without any partitions or provisions. Flats in slab blocks and twin tower blocks were equipped with self-contained washrooms and kitchens or balconies for cooking. A multi-room design was first adopted for Trident blocks. There were windows in both the living room and bedrooms, and also window ledges for air conditioners. The Harmony blocks were also of a multi-room design, but with bigger windows for better ventilation and more daylight. Today, construction of public housing is site-specific, with flexible non-standard design and green concepts integrated to foster an eco-friendly living environment. Public housing estates built in the early years were only provided with very basic facilities and management. Over time, the environment, local facilities and estate management, including security and cleansing services, have seen tremendous improvement. Comprehensive planning of housing estates takes into consideration the everyday needs of tenants. In the early 70s, we encouraged tenants to form mutual aid committees. Since 1996, Estate Management Advisory Committees, or EMACs, have been formed in public rental housing or PRH estates to involve tenant representatives in their own estates management, which also helps to strengthen residents' sense of belonging. Universal design has been widely adopted in both common areas and inside flats, providing barrier-free access to all people and rendering an environment bracing aging in place. The Housing Authority also encourages NGOs and tenants associations to invite their neighbours of ethnic minorities to join activities to help them integrate into the community. A host of activities are also organised on a regular basis by housing estate offices in collaboration with NGOs and EMACs to foster a harmonious community. Since 1978, with the Home Ownership Scheme or HOS and various subsidised housing programs, the Housing Authority has been helping low to middle income families to buy their own homes. To date, over 480,000 subsidised housing flats have been sold. It is an integral part of the government's housing policy to build subsidised housing for sale and boost the turnover of PRH flats. Apart from the HOS, in January 2018, the Housing Authority also made the Green Form Subsidised Home Ownership Scheme a regular feature. This helps tenants and eligible PRH applicants buy their homes and release more flats for waiting families. To shorten the waiting time for PRH applicants, we endeavour to meet the housing production targets and keep enhancing the sustainability of our public housing. We proactively provide in-flat inspections and repairs. And at the same time, improvement works in the older estates are carried out to extend their lifespan. Energy saving and waste reduction measures are also in place to promote an eco-friendly lifestyle. we adopt low-carbon construction methods and energy-saving measures in our new public housing projects. These include making massive use of precast components, avoiding plastering and tiling on walls, and using recycled materials and renewable energy whenever possible. Over the past 6 decades, public housing has been providing stable and affordable homes for generations of low-income families, improving their quality of life, fostering mobility across the social strata, and promoting Hong Kong's economic and social development. Looking to the future, the Housing Authority will keep striving to fulfill its mission of housing for all.
Well, this is the good sign of so-called public housing. So, but I won't say that all public housing are that present or decent. Although my involvement in the Housing Authority for the past 6 years would say that public housing in Hong Kong has been constructed in quite a decent way and also managed in a very good way. Although because of the resources constraint, it may not be comparable with those upmarket residential development, but definitely is much, much better than those sort of down market or lower down in the market sort of private buildings. But behind that, in fact, we may have concealed some of the issues in public housing. Not to say that because of the supply of public housing, we have a shortage of public housing, but also in terms of management, there may be something that we need to take note of and perhaps make some improvement. Although those problems are controversial in a way, because every decision making in public policy may not be able to please everybody. But in this lecture, we will concentrate more on the resources, because although public housing seems to be very good, but it may be good for those who are able to get into public housing. But in fact, we have a very long waiting queue. So these are the changes in the waiting queue in the past 5 years. And in fact, late last year, we still have over 150,000 households in the what we call the general waiting list. This is the general family. And whereas in the single and non-elderly queue, because they need to join another queue, which I'll explain later, there's close to 100,000 people on that. And many of them, in fact, they have to wait for quite long. So last year, in fact, or early this year, the median waiting time is 6 years. Median waiting time means that half of those in the waiting list, when they get allocated, they should at least be waited for 6 years. So only half of them can get public housing unit within 6 years of waiting. So that is not a very sort of good sign, because that is already double the time pledged by the Hong Kong Housing Authority in allocation. The Housing Authority promised the allocation will be done within 3 years at the time, but after the time of when you make the application. And this is just for the general waiting list for the ordinary family. For single non-elderly, because it's a different system, which I'll explain later, many of them, in fact, they have to wait very long. So we did a very quick calculation on the figures that have been released by the Hong Kong Housing Authority and some hypothetical applicants. So if you apply for public housing as a single person at the age of 18, so that is the time when you are just eligible for applying. perhaps you have to wait for 20 and 25 years before you get a public housing unit. If the system remain unchanged and the unit allocated to the single elderly to the single non-elderly remain unchanged. So that is not very promising. So in this lecture, in fact, I want to discuss the public resources distribution with some general concept, which will apply not just to housing, but in other public services as well. But I will concentrate on housing allocation, the public housing allocation, and also on the public housing finance, and particularly the rent setting system as an illustration. So perhaps in some of the discussion is quite technical. For those who are involved in housing management, or perhaps you need to know that. Of course, I mean, a few of you are already working in the housing authority. They may be very familiar with some of the system, but we try to do an analysis on those systems and practices from a more conceptual point of view. So for those who have very detailed knowledge of the system, if you want to supplement some of the system or update the practices, you are welcome to do that. Although I'm myself in the subsidized housing committee of housing authority, but some very detailed implementation, perhaps I may not be so updated, particularly about the implementation. So with that, we want you to have a clear differentiation between the different kind of allocation system, and also to have an evaluation appraisal of those allocation system, and also the ability to appraise the rent setting policy in Hong Kong. And underlying that are the principles and related concepts in public resources distribution. Before we go into these two very specific policy about public housing allocation and rent setting, perhaps I will describe some related concept to public resources distribution, and particularly about distribution of housing resources in the public sector. First, perhaps we need to ask or to answer why we need public sector distribution of resources, but not to distribute the resources in the market sector. Because for most of the services we are enjoying now, the overwhelming majority of them are distributed in the market. The food you get, even public transport, it is provided in what we call public transport, but it's still provided by private operators. All those companies, they are for-profit so-called companies. Although the services they provide are open to the public or it's close to public sector provision than private sector, but still it's in the market. So in fact, we have to understand that most goods and services we enjoy are provided in the market sector. So why we need some so-called resources, some goods and services be provided not in the market sector? Of course, there are many reasons, but there may be two reasons that are particularly relevant to the provision of goods and services in the public sector. The first is, perhaps many of you know, is what we call market failure. So with an ordinary market, the goods and services are unable to be provided with the satisfaction that are close to the general principle of what we call market provision. That is, the supply and demand will be at an equilibrium with the given price signal. So when the price signal change, or when any of that ingredients, supply, demand, and price change, it will trigger the change in the other aspects so that another equilibrium will be achieved. But in many cases, that market may fail. Take for example, housing is a very typical illustration that perhaps the market is not that effective in distributing the resources. So that's why our house price is so high. because either the supply or the demand or the price signal are of some problem. I won't go into detail because it will take long to explain that. But compared to other housing market, the Hong Kong housing market is perhaps has some defects, so that we need some intervention so as to restore the market equilibrium. And the other reason, not related to market failure, or it's weakly related to market failure, is a concept what we call merit good. Because for some goods and services, the society may have some minimal standard. And even if under the market operation, there is equilibrium, but the equilibrium may not match with the social expectation or the social norm. Housing is another example. Take for an example, if we don't have public intervention on housing, people who are on no income, they may have to stay in very poor housing because that is the only housing they can afford. I take for an example, in the subdivided units, some of the subdivided units, they are very cheap, but their living condition, the facility are so substandard that we would feel very worrisome and in fact very sad to see people like us who have to stay in those very poor accommodation. Some poor accommodation in SDU, the subdivided unit, may have to combine toilet with kitchen because the space is so little. So if you want to squeeze those facilities, perhaps combining the kitchen and the toilet is the only way you can do that. First, is against the law. Why is that against the law? Because we set housing as a very good. So the law will set some kind of minimal standard for those facilities. For in this case, it's for hygiene reason. And maybe for other cases, it is for safety reason. So we need to have the door of the kitchen that can be fireproof for an hour, for instance. So if people cannot afford even the minimum standard, there is a justification for the government to chip in and make the provision through various channels to ensure that that minimum standard is being adhered to. So that is what we call merit good. So perhaps housing is a typical example of merit good. And recently in Hong Kong and also in many other countries, basic or minimum wage is also a merit good. So we cannot endure in the labor market, some worker can earn so little, even if they pay off a lot of the energy in working. So in this context, we set a minimum wage requiring the employer to pay at least a certain amount of wage for their workers, for their employees. And if the provision is not efficient in the market, either because of market failure or because of the very good so-called justification, we have to put those goods and commodity out of the market and provided it through non-market means. And that's a concept what we call decommodification. So we turn it from a commodity to a non-commodity. So housing is perhaps one example in many countries as a decommodified good. And in some countries, medical and health is also such a decommodified good. For instance, in the UK, medical services, the bulk majority of them are being offered by the NHS, the National Health Services. So it's all being subsidized by the government. Even they have private general practitioner, but they are all paid by the government. The patient, they don't have to pay to their doctors. So the commodification process will counteract market failure and also to guarantee a minimum level of supply if this goods and services is a merit good. So when a goods and services is being decommodified, cost recovery is usually not a concern. or otherwise, it means it's a market operation. Because it's a non-market operation, so profit and cost recovery is not a main concern. And in doing that, we often would involve some kind of subsidy. But in fact, subsidy is something that it seems to be straightforward. But in fact, if you look at it deeper, it is quite complicated. To give a simple definition of subsidy, subsidy may involve some transfer of resources. It can be money, what we call in the fiscal term, from the government to a non-government organization. But in fact, subsidy can be further divided into different types. So subsidies can give to the producers. When subsidies being given to the producers, it has the impact on the supply in the market. So if there's not enough housing units in the sector because the cost is too high, or production is too high, or on the other hand, there is not enough demand because the consumer cannot pay for the level of price that the producer will find it profitable. So in this case, the government can subsidize the producer so that they can reduce the cost of production, so that the cost of that goods and services can be reduced, so that it can create demand. So if I were to use a supply and demand graph, there is a shift of that supply and demand graph to a new equilibrium. But it can also be handled in the form of consumer subsidy. So subsidy can be paid to the consumer, so that, like in the case I just mentioned, because they are unable to pay the level of price that will make the producer profitable. So the producer will not be willing to make the supply. So if we want to improve the supply, we can empower the consumer so that the consumer can pay a high price to trigger a higher level of supply. But the subsidy can also be positive or negative. Positive are our usual understanding of subsidy. So it's a subsidy that transfers from the government through fiscal form to individuals and organizations in order to change either the supply or the demand. But in fact, the other way would also work in a negative subsidy. Negative subsidy is something what we call tax. So that instead of transferring the subsidy, the resources to the producer or the consumer, we take away the resources from the consumer of the producer in order to change the price signal. But the subsidy can also be in the form of what we call monetary form, in real money. So I can give, for instance, X dollar to the producer in order to change their supply schedule. And this is the actual money being handled. So it's also is common quoted as the subsidy per se. But in fact, subsidy can also be analyzed in economic terms. So either is the difference between the actual cost of production and the apparent cost of production because of the subsidy. But in fact, this may have some kind of multiplying effect, that the actual handout of the real money may have a multiplying effect on the cost. Or if an economic an opportunity cost is concerned, we may count the opportunity cost rather than the actual money being handled. Public housing rent is also a very typical example. So in fact, because of the producer schedule or the producer cost of the public sector is not the same as the private sector, so that there may be higher or lower so-called cost of production in the public sector. So even if you count accountingly, X dollar is being input in the public housing to produce X unit, but in fact, we charge the consumer a certain price that will enable, for instance, just a hypothetical case, enable the producer in the public sector to balance the book. But in fact, because that is not a market operation, so the consideration and cost and also consumer price may not be the same in the public sector as in the private sector. So a unit of public housing, even if there is no subsidy, but because of the structure of the costing, the rent in the public sector may be much, much lower than that in the private sector. But an economic subsidy will compare the same unit regardless whether it's in the public sector, in the private sector. The difference between a tenant who pays to the public tenants, public landlord, or the rent they have to pay to the private landlord, and the difference is what we call an economic so-called subsidy. I'll return such discussion when we discuss about rent setting. The other policy instrument we may use may not involve subsidy, but can also have the effect in influencing supply and demand. So when no subsidy is concerned, the government can make policy to direct the supply and demand, or at least to influence the level of supply and demand, or on price. Take for an example, in mainland China, there is a policy that will make a big influence on the demand, because they set a quota on the consumption of housing. So perhaps one household can just buy one house, but not the second one. Because in the past, if there's no restriction, some rich family, they may buy several houses. But with that regulation, the demand will be suppressed. On the other hand, we can also have a regulation on the supply. So that is what we call a vacancy tax. But in fact, vacancy tax is a misleading concept, because that's not a tax. Because the tax is something that you will levy when some condition is being fulfilled. And it's nothing to do with your behavior. But so what we call the vacancy tax, in fact, is a regulation that want to influence the supply level of housing. In fact, it's not a tax, but a penalty. So if you complete a housing unit, but you withhold it, but not put it on sale in the market, will be penalized. So that is to encourage the producer to put up the completed unit on the market as quick as possible. So in fact, there is an intervention on the market through regulation, because normally without the regulations, it's the producer's discretion whether to put it on the market or not. So just like everybody else, if I possess something, I produce something, it's in my liberty to put it in the market or not. But if you are being told that you have to put it in the market as soon as you complete that, so they have no such discretion to choose the most appropriate time of selling your property. So you can imagine that if there is such a regulation in the sale of stock market share, and you will say that that is a very serious intervention on the market, because as an investor, I should choose the right time for me to sell or buy my stock. You shouldn't impose any regulation on that. But because housing is a very special market, So regulation can change the supply and the demand. And sometimes it is not on the supply and demand the policy will target, it's on the price. And also in mainland China, there is a brief period that they will set the ceiling to some residential development, a ceiling price. So that the price level is restricted. So that is an regulation by government decree to influence the price level. So we have also mentioned that allocation in the public sector, not just housing, but other goods and commodity as well, there may be some associated principles of allocation. The first one, because it's in the public sector, we often will concern about fairness. Fairness means the same policy everybody with similar condition, they should enjoy similar policy or even the same policy that is fair. And the other principle is perhaps on equity. So should be some kind of fair distribution of resources. Fairness means that either you can get it or not get it, should be more or less equal if you are in similar conditions. Equity is you need to have some fair distribution of the resources. I mean, they are not exactly the same, although they're related. But more recently, or in contemporary so-called government, and other so-called principle, or you may say that the constraint is about efficiency. So to maintain fairness, to maintain equity, theoretically is possible, but it may not be efficient. Efficiency means the so-called efficient distribution of resources, so that you cannot have another arrangement of resource distribution that make more so-called people benefit. So that is a reason from the principle of welfare economics. And in the resources distribution in public sector, and we usually concern about the need. Need is a very popular concept of discourse in public policy. So when housing is concerned, it's perhaps the need more is on shelter. So we always talk about the provision of housing from a non-market sector because people have some need. And need, to the very basic interpretation, is the need for shelter. So that's why nearly in every modern society, people concern about homelessness, because homelessness means you are lacking the necessary shelter to achieve some dignified living. But very often, our concern would move beyond the provision of shelter, because housing in modern society is more than shelter. So that is a related concept to the very good concept we just mentioned. So in fact, in many societies, in more modern society, particularly in wealthy societies, the society may have some kind of standard of the quality and the quality of housing being supplied. And we usually set some minimal acceptable standard. As I just mentioned, if we have people, even they have a shelter, but they have to combine toilet with the kitchen, and that will violate our conception about quality of a decent living. And also we're concerned about the hygiene and also about other concerns. So need for housing or housing needs are usually defined in such a way. Some government, they may have an explicit so-called list of that housing need. Others may have some implicit needs that are related to other needs as well. And in generating those needs, regardless it's explicit or implicit, it will connect to culture and social norm. Take for example, subdivided unit is for some poor quality subdivided unit, it may be regarded as unacceptable by many people in the society now. But in fact, the condition of the subdivided unit would be very, very decent. Take, for example, 40, 50 years ago, when we have extreme overcrowding in the private rental sector. So it depends on cultural and social norm and also the stage of development of the society. And it will also be connected to affordability, quality of provisions, spatial standard, or family characteristic. So take, for example, if you're concerned about elderly people, that housing quality may also be connected with other attributes of the building. Take, for example, whether there's a lift so that the old people do not have to walk for 7 to 8 floors. Or otherwise, some of them may deter some of them to go out. And that is also a concern for people with physical handicap. So that if the facility is not friendly to people on wheelchair, they may have difficulties going out. So that will bring a lot of inconvenience to their life. So it depends. But these are a long list of housing needs we will associate with need. And the other concern is in fact about affordability. But to be precise, the society concerned more about unaffordability. So affordability is the level that will perceive people can afford to pay for their housing, either rent or buy. But because buying is of a high standard, so usually a lower standard is the concern for renting. So for most society, the benefits will go to housing on renting, although there's some exception. In some country, when buying is the dominant form of housing, and then the government may concern about people unable to buy. And there are so-called many indicators of unaffordability. But the most commonly used indicator is something what we call the rent to income ratio. And as a sum of rule, 25% or 30% have been used in many countries as the threshold of unaffordability. Take for example, in the United States, in many states and cities, if you have to pay rent more than 30% of your income, you are eligible for housing assistance. And also in Hong Kong, that is also a threshold. These two are the threshold we use for the rent assistance scheme, although we also have used other threshold as well. But there are also other measurements in housing affordability, because the rent to income ratio is just a rough ratio and it takes no account of the level of income. Take for example, if you are very rich, but you choose to spend a lot on your housing. You earn $100,000 per month, but I spend $50,000 on a very decent house. So I have to spend 50% of my income on housing. But nobody will perceive such a household as unaffordable. So that's why some other measurement, they will use what we call the residual income measurement, so that it will only take into account the income left behind after you pay for housing. So take, for example, for a poor household, even if they pay a low percentage of their income on rent, but what are being left is unable to allow them to have a decent sort of living standard. Take, for example, if I'm a poor household who earns just $10,000 as a wage, but I only spend about $2,000 in housing, which is extremely limited. And what you get is a very indecent housing. What you have left is about just $8,000. So if you just left $8,000 for a family of 3 and 4, in fact, you are under the poverty line. So we use other measurement as well. But what's complicated is what income being included in evaluating the rent-to-income ratio, on what housing costs and what other costs are being accounted for, is still not settled in academic debate. But I won't bother you about the details, but I have some references that would enable you to trace that. And finally, a concept is about equality of what, or equality for what. So what we call equality in distribution of public resources, what does it mean? So of course, there are many philosophical discussion on that. Take for example, Etima Sen has a very famous discussion on equality in a lecture in the early 70s, describing what he means by equality when public resources distribution is concerned. But it's more philosophical to explain. Whereas Julian Lagrange, economist in the UK in the early 80s, when he discussed about the strategy of equality, raised so-called 5 interpretations of equality when subsidy or distribution of resources, public resources, is concerned. The first is on the equality in public expenditure, so as everybody enjoying the same amount of public expenditure. So that is more or less the basis of transfer in education in many societies. So all societies, in many societies, you have a certain year of compulsory free education. So if we assume that every education opportunity will cost the same amount of public resources, so everybody is enjoying the same amount of public expenditure. That seems to be fair, but some would argue that that's not fair, because you should not give those expenditure, public transfer, to those people who are rich. They can afford more. Whereas if they do not have to pay for their public education, they may use their private money to fund other education opportunity, whereas a poor household is unable to do that. So even on the services, the distribution of public resources is equal, but underlying that, the rich household, they may have additional resources they save from that equality in public expenditure to create other education opportunity for their children. They may be better off. The other is about the equality in income. So that would apply to the social security assistance or social assistance, so that the society will assume that every individual or household would be able to enjoy the minimum level of living unless they possess a certain level of income. So if they do not have the ability to earn that level, the society perhaps will top up their income so that they would have at least that minimal level of income. So that is behind the principle of social assistance, or our comprehensive social assistance scheme. So if you are on the social in the CSSA in Hong Kong, for instance, you have some work, but your work is low income. Take for example, the minimal income the government will guarantee is 10,000, and you have a work that will pay you 5,000. So the government will just pay you 5,000 to top you up to the income. And that is also the principle in many Chinese cities on the minimal income standard. So the government will just pay you up on that. So you may say that that is a disincentive to work, because why should I spend my energy working, whereas I would only achieve that minimal income level compared to my neighbors who do not have to work. So it seems to be equal in terms of the guarantee for minimum standard, but in fact, that may not be fair, because people who work hard to earn a living have a loss on that. So there is a very big debate behind what we call the work disincentive in those benefits. And other interpretation of the equality of distribution of public resources is the equality in use. And this will apply mostly to the use of medical services. So that the medical services, because not everybody will need that medical services. So you would not have equality of distribution of that resources to everybody. But if people need more medical services, they should be able to use that level. So they may get more public resources because they have a need of using that. So that is the use of public resources with reference to your need. But it can be on an interpretation of what we call private cost. Just like in either public medical and health services or in the public education. Because people on different income, they may be able to afford different level of consumption. So it may be fair, in fact, to achieve equality if those who are on high income, they should pay more. Whereas those who are in the low income, they should pay less. So there is the design of some sort of system of providing medical and health services through social insurance, or to provide retirement benefit through public insurance, so that your contribution is tied with the level of income. So if you earn more, you contribute more. But when you retire, everybody gets the same pension. So that is what we call the principle of equality based on private cost. So to ensure that everybody have the same access when they have the need, and they should contribute to the provision of those services according to their ability. And the final interpretation is the equality of outcome, because everybody may start in a different starting point. Take, for example, education. There is a difference in intellectual ability, so that those who have learning difficulties, perhaps they need more resources to top them up to the ability that are at least comparable to their contemporary or their peer that are higher in the intellectual ability. So that is behind the additional resources that have been put to people with learning difficulties, with other difficulties that enable them to catch up, or something what we call positive discrimination, so that the opportunity seems to be equal, but is extremely unequal for those who have a very different sort of starting point. So that you need to have a particular enhancement of opportunity or resources to enable them to catch up. So these are the different interpretation of sort of distribution of public resources. So when it is connected to the distribution of public resources on public housing, so we first will describe allocation. So the allocation, in fact, the most basic one, or the very preliminary sort of starting point about allocation, is something what we call need-based allocation. Need-based allocation, like the need we just mentioned, is defined by the third party. Third party means that it's not the producer, it may not be the consumer, but a third independent party. In this case, it's most likely the government. And in most of the need-based allocation system of public housing, they will usually, but not exclusively, involve a waiting list. Because a waiting list is an expression of housing needs and preferences. I'll elaborate in details what we mean by waiting list as indication of need and preferences. So in this allocation system of need-based system, we can further divide up the system into sort of different areas. One is what we call primary allocation, and the other is what we call a secondary allocation. Primary allocation is a system of inclusion, so that you set some criteria so that you include some people. But if you look at it from another perspective, it is also a system of exclusion, so that some people, they are not included in the enjoyment of those public resources. In the inclusion exercise, we will define eligibility, who are eligible on that. If public housing is concerned, over the world that operate public housing, many cities, they will use the length of residence, whether they own a property, or according to the age, and in some cities, including Hong Kong, that's the income, but not exclusive, because later on we have some example that some allocation criteria may not involve income. Whereas in Hong Kong, we will consider the eligibility of the length of residence, so that if you are only eligible to apply for public housing or allocated public housing after half of your family members reach the permanent citizen status. That is, they have come and stayed in Hong Kong at least for 7 years. And you cannot own a property, and the applicant, they need to pass the age of 18, as I just mentioned previously. And they also have to, so-called, not in some city in Hong Kong, you need to pass an income test. And exclusion is a rationing sort of process. So whereas in Hong Kong, as I just mentioned, new immigrants, they are being excluded. Young people, although they're included in the list, but because of the long waiting times, in fact, when they are being allocated, they will be middle-aged. So that's why we can draw the conclusion that young people, in fact, they are being excluded in the public housing sector, unless they apply together with another family member. So young singles are being excluded in the public housing because they have no chance in their youth, they will be allocated public housing, unless they are in very special so-called condition. So in that inclusive list, I've just mentioned that you need to pass the age of 18, half your family is permanent housing. You need to pass the income sort of threshold. And if you're all satisfied that, you can join the waiting list. In fact, in Hong Kong, we do not just have one waiting list, we have several. The first is something what we call a general waiting list. So if you're a family and you can join what we call a general waiting list. So that is the majority of that. So that is also, I just mentioned, about 150,000 households joining the queue. Elderly single or elderly couple, they have another queue. They would not mix up with the general waiting list. And single non-elderly under the age of 65 and above the age of 18, they have a separate waiting queue. There's a fourth waiting queue, is what we call a special list. That will consist junior civil servants, they have a queue, and also a special queue, what we call a compassionate so-called rehousing, which I will return when we mention about the secondary allocation. For the income, you have the income eligibility, and the housing authority, they have an explicit rule in setting their income eligibility. They will make reference of the need for a household in Hong Kong in renting a private accommodation, while at the same time they are also able to cover their non-housing expenses. So they will calculate the income threshold with the housing cost plus the non-housing cost and also 5% of contingents. So the housing cost is being referenced to the unit rent for a private flat, which is comparable to the size that will be allocated to that particular family. So for instance, in our allocation standard, we will allocate 7 square meters to the household per person. So you will have the average rent per meter square in private sector, and also times 7 square meters times the number of people in your household. So you have that level of income that will enable you to pay for such a housing unit in the private sector. Whereas after paying for that, you still have some money that will push you up to the level of an average household in the lower half of expenditure group. So it's very explicit that public housing is targeted at the lower half of the income spectrum, but they will only count the average to the non-housing expenditure of that group. And it also takes into account the change of inflation and the change in the minimum wage, because the statistic is lacking behind. So they need to bring it forward, because that threshold will apply to applicant now, but the statistics of either rent or that particular non-housing expenditure are lacking behind, with a 5% of expenditure. So in fact, when your income level is more than that, the Hong Kong government will presume that you will be eligible, you will be affordable to private renting, so you are not eligible for public housing. So this is our most recent so-called level of eligibility. So you can see that compared with the medium income, when small family, they are above the medium income, whereas for bigger family, they are below the household income. So you may say that the public housing is pitched on average on the lower 40% of household in the income spectrum. So in fact, public housing is not, unlike in many other countries, a tenure only for the poorest. So that you may say that is an average family are all eligible for public housing. And after you pass those eligibility criteria, so you are able to enter into the waiting queue. But how resources are being allocated for those who are already in the waiting queues is a process what we call secondary allocation. Secondary allocation will involve a process what we call matching, and the other process what we call ranking. Matching will match household size with the dwelling, or in some places, the rent level with the income of the incoming tenant, so that small family will be allocated smaller housing unit, poorer family will be allocated cheaper accommodation. Although the later criteria is not exercised in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, we only match household size with the unit size. But in Hong Kong, we also match with the area or the district you want to live. So besides matching people. So although our stated stated policy is 7 square meter per person in allocation, because that haven't been catch up with the norm of the society, 7 square meter per person is quite small. So recent allocation will raise the standard, in fact, to more or less 11 square meter per person in actual allocation. And when you make the application, you can choose a district, either urban, extended urban. Extended urban means Sha Tin, Chunwan, or Jiangguan, something like that, or other new territory district or the island. But in fact, as far as I know, the urban and the extended urban areas have been already closed to application. So if you apply now, most likely you have to opt for new territory. Even if you opt for island, it's not, you could not be faster, because the islands, the production of public housing in islands is extremely small. And in ranking, there are at least sort of 4 very common systems you can find in the world. And we also have that 4th system in Hong Kong as well. So one is what we call the merit scheme, and the other is the order scheme. The third one is a group scheme, and the other is a point scheme. Merit scheme based on the ranking with personal assessment. So that is being implemented in small local authority in the UK. So they don't have explicit criteria. It just depends on the assessment of the housing authority, the housing officials, to assign dwelling to different households. But because the number of supply and the number of demand is small, so in fact it's easier to manage. Whereas in Hong Kong, we also have a special queue, not queue, but a special group that what we call a compassionate rehousing. So if you have some urgent need for housing on medical or social ground, you can apply to the social welfare department, not the housing department, to get access to public housing. And the social workers in the housing, in the social welfare department will make assessment and make the priority of allocation, and then nominate the applicants to the housing department to do that. So every year, in recent years, we routinely assign about 2,000 units for compassionate rehousing. But in the past few years, not all those quotas have been used up. So take, for example, last year, we only used up about 1,000 units. But still, every year, we still allocated 2,000 units on that, because we don't know about the need. Because you cannot join a waiting list, because there is some kind of urgent need. So once you make an application to the social welfare department, or the social workers, the welfare department will identify you as having such urgent need. They will make an assessment and allocate. In fact, the most popular secondary allocation mechanism is what we call a day order scheme. So it can towards your time on waiting. So it's on the first come, first serve so-called principles. So in Hong Kong, the general house waiting list is of this kind. So you have to wait when it's your turn. The housing department will inform you that it's almost your turns. So that will announce in short time what estate, what housing unit you're being assigned to. And the third one, the group scheme, is to define some subgroup having a special need, so that they may have a different priority. But in fact, this group scheme is not a standalone so-called scheme. They usually have to combine with other schemes. Take, for example, in Hong Kong, our elderly may be a group scheme of that. I mean that if you apply together with an elderly, a relative, family member, you will jump the queue a little bit. In the past, you can jump the queue for 1 year. I'm not quite sure about the updated scenario now. Whereas the junior civil servant, they will also have a separate queue. So that is a group scheme. But what kind of criteria they use is not that transparent. At least I don't know. or it has not been reported into the housing authority or housing authority members. Whereas single non-elderly, they are special group, although they form a queue, but because there's also a quota on that. So that's why you may say that it's a group scheme to combine with a PON scheme. A PON scheme is a system that will allocate points according to special circumstances, so that those who have more points, they will be higher in the priority of allocation. So there are many criteria that are being used elsewhere. The most commonly used criteria are overcrowding, your health conditions, whether you have a decent facility or you have all the facility that are necessary, or based on family circumstances. If you're a single person, if you're elderly, you may get high priority. Whereas in Hong Kong, a single non-elderly is exercising a PON scheme because you're eligible if you're between the age of 18 and 65. But there are two components in counting the point. One component is the year of waiting. So it's like the day order. But on top of that is your age. So 1 year in waiting time get you 1 point. But when you get older by 3 years, you get 3 points. So that you can accumulate more points, in fact, when you are older. So if you enter the queue at the age of 45, in fact, you earn a lot of points ahead of your young counterparts. So the system in Hong Kong, in fact, because of the predominant day order, it appears to be fair, at least on the surface. But it can only achieve what we call the equality of public expenditure. And there's no concern on individual need. Take, for example, if you are in a very poor condition, that we will not jump the queue unless you fall to the category eligible for compassionate rehousing. But your condition have to be very poor in order to be eligible for that. So besides the need-based allocation, there's another allocation that have modified on the need-based, or is to mitigate or to change the inadequacy of need-based, because need-based allocation has a shortcoming. Basically, need-based allocation, whatever scheme you adopt, will only cater for individual need. It may not be that well to cater for community need. Take for example, if in a system that will give more points to elderly people, so you will end up with a lot of elderly people in public housing. But with more people, more old people in public housing, they concentrate in a particular estate or area, it will make those areas easily to deteriorate, particularly when so-called shopping facilities is concerned. And in fact, that happened in Hong Kong, not because of the allocation system, but because of the age of the estate. So in fact, for many older estates, most of the residents, they are old people. They would not move out, or they're unable to move out. And so the business in those estates, they are not profitable because of the reduction in purchasing power of those elderly. So most business closed down, and it's the elderly residents who will suffer. And because needs are being assessed by a third party, whatever it's a day order system, it is a so-called PON system, it will only consider the third party defined housing need. It may not be the need of the tenant, particularly when secondary allocation is concerned. So you have a fixed rules, but regardless of what the tenants want, I mean, the Hong Kong system is quite an example. So the public tenants, they can only choose a broad area when they make the application. So you may say that the new territory can span from Sha Tin to Tin Shui Wai, and which are 30 kilometers away and in very different part of Hong Kong. So if you used to live in Sha Tin, but then you're allocated to Tin Shui Wai, you have to uproot all your living environment, all your connection. So that may not be the interest of the tenants. So that's why for some subdivided unit tenants, when they have to rely on living in the urban area for living and for their daily necessity, they are very reluctant to apply for public housing. When they know that now, even if they can get public housing allocated, is more or less in the very remote area of the new territory, and it would interrupt their routines in their life. And also, the allocation system, particularly about the eligibility, may produce pervasive incentive for tenants. Take for example, there are already rumors, although there's nothing to confirm, that people are suppressing their income in order to pass that rule. So that in fact you are bringing some kind of disbenefit to tenants because of that. And also, it will encourage the applicants who are in better housing to wait for longer in order to get a better quality housing. Whereas if you are in poor housing, you are more eager to move into public housing so that it's more affordable and at least it can improve your living environment, but they will usually end up in the poorest sectors of public housing. And that's also the case in Hong Kong as well, because although Hong Kong have all the system that you can only have free offer and free refusal, or otherwise you will be put back in the waiting list and you have to wait for more years. But even that, if I am already in a better housing and not very high rent, because I was lucky, then I can wait for long. I can even for 10 years in order to get a good and new accommodation in the urban area. So that may not be something regarded as equitable. And also the need definition may be easily influenced by politics. So young people housing is already some example. So if income and waiting time is the criteria, so it should not differentiate whether you are young or you are family. So if you are young and single, if you have such a need, you should have the equal chance of being allocated compared with a family. Even there's some differentiated need, that difference should not be that big. Because now it's quite big. Because I just mentioned, if you are young when you apply, by the time when you make the application when you are young, you may have to wait for 20 years before you are allocated. Whereas in ordinary family, they only have to wait for 6 or 8 years on that. So the difference is simply too big. But because that definition of need have been strongly influenced by politics, or what we call some mainstream so-called perception. So that is not just applying to public housing allocation, but for other so-called welfare benefits consideration as well. So you may say that young people now in Hong Kong are largely being discriminated in the enjoyment of welfare. And in fact, the allocation system will produce exclusion and discrimination from the explicit policy. Take for example, new immigrants are being excluded in applying for housing in public Hong Kong unless you get permanent residence. But they may have the need. Although whether to allow them to have a need is something politically debatable. But at least that is a very, very apparent discrimination and exclusion as well. Even if there is no such exclusion or discrimination in the state policy, but in real practice, it can be discriminatory, but unintentional. Take for example, even for a ethnic minority family, when many of them, in fact, they are born in Hong Kong, so all of them, they are permanent residents from the start. Of course, I mean, they can apply for public housing from the very beginning, but because most ethnic minority, particularly those from South Asia, they have big family. But our production of public housing will incline towards small family because the family size in Hong Kong are getting smaller and smaller. So now the average household size in Hong Kong is in public housing in Hong Kong is just 2.6 person. So that we in fact do not have so-called units that enable big family to live together. So usually the ethnic minority family, they have to wait for quite long in order to have that, I would say that the secondary allocation mechanism of matching household size with dwelling size. So in fact, there has been nearly no housing unit in Hong Kong, with the exception of a few housing unit in old estates for big family, because we used to have big family in the past, so that in some old housing estate, we still have big dwellings that can accumulate about 8 or 10 people, but they are getting very, very few now. So the second best choice is to allocate those families in adjacent units. But even that the housing department found it extremely difficult. So then they relax it as allocation for housing unit for that family on the same floor, but they may not be adjacent. But even that also found to be very, very difficult. So more recently, in fact, the allocation would be already relaxed on the same block, but in different floor. But you can imagine, how can a family with small children manage in such a situation? So it will put the ethnic minority family in a very unfavorable and even not workable social condition. So with those inadequacy in the needs-based system, there has been proposal elsewhere to have a choice-based allocation system. The choice allocation system would aim at empower the tenants to make choice so that their satisfaction can be enhanced, and also to take into consideration of the community need so that to make the community more sustainable. And of course, some basic driving force is to help the housing authority of some city to release their vacant properties as quick as possible, and also to respond to changing expectation of the tenants to have more choice. So that has been started firstly in the Netherlands, in the city Delft, which is a very beautiful medieval cities that are built along a network of canals. So it's very beautiful and very quiet. But of course, I mean, they also have public housing. Although the quality of public housing in the Netherlands are not comparable to that of Hong Kong, they are so decent. And for us, it can be regarded as luxurious housing. And in fact, the system will maintain no waiting list. So when there is new public housing being constructed, or more likely, there are some public housing units that are being vacant because of the tenants move out, the housing authority, they will advertise the vacancy. And you do not have to keep a waiting list or apply to make an application. You would only make an application whenever there's a vacancy. So the eligible applicants will make application, and the priority of allocation will be assessed by the determined scale. For instance, they have a point scale. So they come towards your housing quality, the area consumption you are now, and any special family need, etc. So with that, you will have a priority. So you can choose to take it or not take it. If you don't take it, and then you will have the second priority household making the choice. In fact, in Hong Kong, we also have the choice-based system, but not in public rental housing, but in our own home ownership scheme. So our home ownership scheme do not keep a waiting list. So they will advertise for vacancy or for new developments, so that if you are interested, if you are eligible, you can apply. Although after the application, they will not have a system of making ranking. The ranking will be made by drawing lots, by a ballot system. But that is the same principle as the Delft model. And the choice allocation system, in fact, it may improve the social mix, because you will have sort of household on different needs that will make the application. Particularly when vacant property is being released from older tenants because they die. And it may be the younger family who have interest, or younger people who have interest to apply. And it also will solve the problem of high refusal rate, because if you are not interested in that particular sort of vacant property, you will not make an application. So the refusal rate will be much lower compared with the need-based system. When there's vacancy, you just ask people in the highest priority to choose, but they may not be interested of that particular property, so they refuse. So that is a waste of resources of this administrative arrangement. And we also reinforce public housing as a safety net, because those who have the need, they will eventually come forward to apply. You do not have to put them in a waiting list and priority. And because they have the need, and with that predefined so-called scale or the criteria, they will eventually rise to the top of the priority. But on a larger scale evaluation of the scheme, when it's being adopted to the UK in many housing authorities, because in the year 2000, the UK central government will urge the local authority to adopt such a system from the Delft model to the public housing allocation. Although eventually not all local authority adopt that, but a more detailed study in 2010 will reveal that, or perhaps when the system is being spread to a wider geographic scope, they may only work in high demand area. Whereas in low demand area, because of the high demand, in fact, the allocation would not work in such a case, because you may receive a lot of application on every advertisement that have been put up. So if every advertisement have results not too different from the waiting list, then the choice system may not work in an efficient way. And also, the choice of the applicants may put them into some consideration that they may want to live in areas that will match with the ethnic minority mix, so that they are living closer to their relatives, so it's better for community support. So in fact, it end up where to authorities that adopt the choice-based letting system will have more community of ethnic concentration, have even a higher concentration of that ethnic minority group. And that may not be good to have a more diversified social mix. And that would also happen to poor applicants when they apply for that choice-based sort of system. They will end up in deprived area where the rent may be lower. Because you can imagine that if I have on a high income, I may be able to afford so-called better location, although the rent is higher. So it will also create some unintentional segregation of poor people and rich people being segregated in different areas. Although the report will also cover it up, with that result not being attributed mainly to the choice-based system, but because of the housing stock being dilapidated, and there's a lot of deprived neighborhood. So we'll never end up, I mean, new public housing entrants will end up in those deprived areas and in a high concentration of ethnic minority because of the changing demography of those so-called cities. So when the distribution of public resources in terms of finance is concerned, there may be a different consideration and different debate. So there's not my intention to have a detailed analysis of the public finance system of housing, but I will touch on a little bit basic principle of housing finance and getting Hong Kong as an example. And I will specifically concentrate on the rent control, rent setting system of Hong Kong. On the housing finance system of Hong Kong, in fact, public housing in Hong Kong is being administered by the Hong Kong Housing Authority with the help of the Housing Department. And the Hong Kong Housing Authority has been asked to be financially independent since 1988, so that they have to earn their own income and they use that income for their own expenditure. So the main source of income of the Housing Authority are basically from rent, from the domestic, over 800,000 domestic properties, and also from the sales of the home ownership scheme. But there are also some income from the shopping center or car park, and also some income from the interest from the investment, because the Hong Kong Housing Authority has accumulated a lot of surplus, and they do the investment and earn sort of investment return. On the expenditure side, there are basically the recurring costs of management and maintenance in the public rental sector, and also the cost of building new public home HOS and also public rental housing. But on top of that, there are also some expenditure that the housing authority is providing as public services for the government. But the cost is being borne by the housing authority. Like for example, the housing estate, they have to control the so-called hawkers. They need to pay for cleaning, security services, similar to private housing. But they also have the cost in controlling the squatter areas of Hong Kong. And in doing that, in fact, the housing authority is subsidizing public rental housing from the surplus they generate from the sales of HOS, and also from the rent in the shopping center, and also, of course, from the investment returns. But in 2003, when they stopped selling HOS, they envisaged a very big shortfall in the cash flow in public housing, because the majority of the surplus are generated from the sale of public housing. So when HOS stop, they need to fill up that gap. So in 2005, they proposed to sell off their commercial properties and car parks to raise 20 billion Hong Kong dollars to fill up such a gap. And those properties, they are being sold to a newly formed real estate investment trust called the Link, which are listed in the stock market to raise that capital. Although the financial sustainability of housing authority will depend on several factors. Take, for example, whether the government will support to inject capital, or the rental income will keep on increase and fill the gap, or the sales of HOS will continue so the housing authority can generate a lot of services from their sale, or whether there's some improvement in efficiency in management so that they can contain the management outgoing so that to give a balance. And there is also the context that they outsource public housing management to the private sector in the year 2000 in order to save costs. And the other is also depend on whether they have to redevelop old public housing so that you have a lot of capital need. But just now, the finance of the housing authority is quite healthy because of the continuation of HOS sales, so that they generate a lot of income from the sale. So in fact, this year it's expected that the Hong Kong Housing Authority will accumulate over 10 billion of surplus. And this surplus will increase, so that a few years later in 2025 and 26, there will even be a 16 billion surplus in the Hong Kong Housing Authority, more than enough to support the expanding building projects of public rental housing. And rent is one component of balancing that book, as I just mentioned. So if you are able to recover more rent, the financial health of the Hong Kong Housing Authority will improve. And setting rent, in fact, is a very important policy in public housing, perhaps only after the allocation policy. So the general principle of setting rents in Hong Kong is make reference to the affordability of the tenant, and also make public housing sustainable, so that we would not need a lot of subsidy for public rental housing. And doing that, we also will ensure a rational allocation of public resources among tenants, and also the rent policy will enhance the tenant's choice, but also to enhance the efficiency of the housing authorities in managing their stock, so as the rent between different estates will reflect their comparative value. And in practice, the rent differentials are being set. Rent differentials means the rent difference between different estates, or even within the estate between different housing units. In setting those differentials, in fact, the Hong Kong Housing Authority are using different criteria. First, the rent in different locations will be different. So in urban areas, more convenient, so the rent is much higher than a comparable housing estates in neutral territory in which the location is not that convenient. And also the age of the estates also counts. So older estate with lower rent, newer estate with newer rent, with a higher rent, to reflect on the different quality of buildings and also on the facilities. And the design of the property would also matter. So if you have a better design, so in the videos we mentioned about different design. So different designs may bring different benefits to the residents. Take for example, for more modern design, they have fixed partitions so that you do not have to spend money in making the partitions, and they have bigger windows so that it's lighter, so you have a better life. And the surrounding environment and transportation is also a consideration. So that is closer to the rent differential in private sector. But even considering all those principles, but because that principle is just a broad brush principles, and they are not implementing so-called market principle on that. So in fact, it ends up with public sector rents are only about 20% to 25% of that of the private sector. So that is what we call economic subsidies. So if we compare the rent, a public tenant will pay for their public rent, for their so-called public housing. But when this public housing is no longer in the public sector, but being released in the private sector, and the same tenants have to pay for market rent, and the difference is what we call it economic subsidy. Whereas a monetary subsidy are the subsidy in terms of money the Hong Kong Housing Authority is putting into that particular housing unit. So it's basically is about the depreciation of that public housing unit, and also with the repair and maintenance and management costs of that. It can be much lower than the economic subsidy. And besides that, so-called explicit rent setting principles, we also have other related policy on rent. One is called what we call a rent assistance scheme. So when your income is low, you can apply for a rent assistance. I won't go into details because you can read the notes. Whereas we have another policy on what we call a housing subsidy policy. So that is targeted on better off or well-off tenants. So that's also called a well-off tenants policy. So that if you earn more than the income eligibility limit, you need to pay for high rent. And when that multiple reach 5, so if your income is 5 times the relevant income eligibility limit, you can no longer stay in the public housing sector. You have to move out. But in fact, in the past years, there are not too many so-called households that have been evicted because of their income past that threshold. Because before they reach the threshold, they have the incentive, in fact, to buy HOS flats. Because for public housing tenants, they have priority in buying HOS flats. So that for most those tenants, they would already preempt the eviction by opting for the home ownership scheme, unless they do not have much choice on that, or at the period when the HOS no longer supply. And recent years, in fact, there are debates on reforming the rent in the public housing sector because the rents are too low. Take for an example, a recent estate completed in Tuen Mun for a unit of 36 square meters. They only charge about 2,200. So that is a unit for 3 to 4 people. There is a comparable public housing unit in Tuen Mun, although it's not exactly comparable because the location and also the facility are not the same, but the difference is not that big. You need to pay for 12,000 for a month. So there is a 5 times difference on that. Even your discount for the difference in quality and the difference in location, there's still 4 to 5 times. And so because of that difference, the census statistics will reveal that, in fact, in 2016, public tenants on average, they only have to pay less than 10% of their income on rent, whereas for tenants in the private sector who rent a room or rent a back space, they need to pay 17%. Whereas for tenants in subdivided unit in 2020, they even have to pay on average 30% on that. So you have that big difference on that. So that's why there are debates that will say that because of the low rent, and we have to pay high subsidy on that, and that may not be fair for everybody because it ends up in 2020, the deficit in rental housing operation account for 259 million out of that 17,000 something million of rent. So it's about 2% of so-called deficit. So if you can raise the rent of those who can afford to achieve some equality of private income or private cost, it may be more equitable in that. But of course, I mean, this is highly controversial. Or even you don't raise the rent of in general, you can enlarge the rent differential so that people who have lower housing quality, they have to pay lower rent. Because a research in the early 2000s will reveal that, in fact, even if of all those principles in rent setting of rent differential, the basic sort of difference is about location and historical reason, whether your estate is new or is old. So the quality, all those other housing attributes, they are largely irrelevant. And there is also a more extreme proposal of a fixed contract. So that is a reform to housing subsidy policy. So you don't have to wait for your income to increase 5 times the eligibility so-called limit. With a lower household, with a lower threshold, your contract will be 10-year contract will be reconsidered. So you need to reconsider your contract in a fixed period, either 5 years or 10 years, so that people who are above the threshold will be kicked out to vacate the public housing unit for reallocation. Of course, these are extremely so controversial. So sorry for the control of time, because the time is up, so I have to rush for the summary. So in fact, we introduced the need for the commodification and the need for subsidy. So that involved the redistribution of resources. So with that, we also have different form of subsidy, and we have to differentiate need and affordability in those so consideration of subsidy. And we also have different consideration of equality as well. Of public expenditure, of use, of private costs, of final outcome. And in designing the allocation system, which is a very important system in distributing public resources, we have two main so-called approach. One is to need, and other is to choice. So need-based will usually involve waiting time, waiting list, and the waiting list will also involve the setting of eligibility, matching, and ranking. And because of the shortcoming of the need-based letting system, a choice-based system is being proposed to replace that, or at least to mitigate the shortcoming of that. Although the outcome of the choice-based system is not as favorable as it is designed. And in the allocation of housing resources, rent setting is a very important consideration. So we may have the balance of the affordability of the tenants and also the efficiency in the housing authority, and especially about the financial sustainability. And rent differential is also the reflection of the utility of the stock, but will also reflect the final user cost of that. When the system in Hong Kong is concerned, our allocation system is basically on a need-based day order. Although it's on surface is fair, but it can only achieve equality of expenditure, but have little regard on tenants' need. And again, it also suffers from some explicit discrimination and some implicit but intentional discrimination as a minority. When Hong Kong is concerned, the rent policy is also being able just to maintain an equality of public expenditure, but have no regard on the equality of private costs, because poor tenants do not receive more subsidy, so that they have to pay more from their private so-called user costs to top up those differences. And although the low-end regimes in Hong Kong is able to cater for affordability of tenants, but they may not be able to achieve efficiency or efficient use of public resources because of the relatively high level of economic subsidy. So perhaps I need to stop here, because some of you may have to rush to your seminar or presentation or participation. So sorry for the poor maintenance of timekeeping. So see whether you have any problem or anything that you would like to ask. So I already have one question, not on the course content, but on some of the procedure of the course of examination. We will still have the plan to hold examination in the examination weeks. And we are waiting for the university to announce what format the examination will be held. So if everything will resume to nearly normal, or perhaps we will hold the examination on campus. But if the situation doesn't allow, we have precedents in the past, in fact, we will hold the examination online. But if we have to hold the examination online, we need to follow some procedure. So by then, you'll be noticed to install a software, and also to make some practices on how to use what we call the second device to monitor the examination process. We have that in the last 2 years, so don't worry. I mean, some of you may have, not some, but I would say that a few of you may have experienced that. Whereas the majority of you may not have the experience. We will do some practices on that, so don't worry. So in case you are not able to develop a second device, we may have some arrangement for very few of you who need to come back to campus to do the examination. I'll make the announcement soon, but I'm still waiting for the instruction of the university on how we would hold the examination. So we have to make preparation for either format. So I'm not quite sure whether it address your concern. But anyway, we have no plan to change the examination format. You will still have the examination. And the examination will be very similar to examinations of this course in the past. So basically, you will be offered 6 questions to choose, and you have to answer 2 questions. And we'll cover a wide range of the topics we covered. But we still haven't made a decision whether we will so-called divide up the examination paper into sections. We may or may not. We'll make a decision in a few weeks. Okay, any other question on that? Or any question on the lecture I deliver? Or for those who work in the housing authority, you may have more detailed information on that. So if you want to correct or revise some of my another question also about exam. So it will be a closed book exam. In fact, a closed book exam is easier than an open book exam, because you can imagine that if this is an open book exam, the exam question will be much more difficult, so that you cannot simply sort of copy from the books, from the article, or from your notes. So unless I test you a lot on recalling the information, so I will not bother you just to memorize all the so-called information. But you'll be assured that the examination will not test you about your memory of recalling some information. The exam time will be standard, 2 hours. We will have more instruction and information at the exam in due course. So if you have further questions, you can either email me on campus or by the university email system. Or otherwise, I will hand over to Dr. Huang next lecture, and I'll return in the last lecture to do some revision and to brief you more on the examination. So until then, goodbye, and see you again in 4 weeks' time. So thank you very much.